It's an honor to introduce our speaker, Kirsten Mandala, class of 2011. This session is Change and Adaptation in the Developing World. It will run for about 70 minutes. Our speaker will present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. Kirsten currently manages a portfolio of disaster risk reduction and climate change programming for Mercy Corps in Timor-Leste, building the resilience of vulnerable communities to ecological hazards and the adverse impacts of climate change in both rural and in urban settings. Kirsten has worked with Mercy Corps since 2015. Before joining the team in Timor-Leste, she provided support to corporate and foundation-funded programs in India, Nepal, China, Mongolia, Myanmar, Indonesia, and Timor. Prior to Mercy Corps, Kirsten worked on peacebuilding programs with civil society organizations in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Kirsten holds a Master of Public Administration focused on global leadership and management, and is currently pursuing a Master of Science focused on global energy and climate policy. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, Amy. I'm calling in from Dili, Timor-Leste. As Amy mentioned, there might be some technical glitches just due to internet connectivity, so please bear with me if we have any challenges. And also, it is 7 in the morning here, and so I am still on my first cup of coffee, so apologies. So to get started, as Amy mentioned, I am working for Mercy Corps as a program manager for our disaster risk and climate change portfolio. And I do not I'm lucky to work with
Kirsten?
Yes.
Pardon me. We're having some issues hearing your audio. If you turn off your camera and we listen to your audio while you've got your slides going, that might be a way to resolve that a little bit. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me okay now?
A little better, yeah.
Okay, great. So I was saying that there might be some challenges to the connectivity issues in terms of calling from Timor-Leste. So thank you for your patience and apologies if we do have any challenges. Are you hearing me okay at this point? Maybe, okay. Well, I'll keep going and please let me know if I should slow down. So as mentioned, I am currently acting as the Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Program Manager for Mercy Corps Programming in Timor-Leste. I am a general manager of a program of programs, or a portfolio of programs addressing disaster and climate change risks. And today I'm going to be talking about adaptation in the developing world, really focusing on the work that I've been doing in Timor-Leste with Mercy Corps for the past few years, using a resilient approach to address the impact of climate change in Timor. In terms of what I'm going to be covering today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about Mercy Corps' global framework, climate change strategy, and resilience. And so I know as Reedies, we all love our theory, so we'll start at that global theoretical level in terms of how we're thinking about climate change work and adaptation in our development programming. I'll then talk a little bit about Timor-Leste here, and in particular, how climate change is impacting Timorese communities. And then finally, I'll discuss my work for the past 2 years in terms of applying some of those strategies and approaches into climate resilient development in Timorese communities, both rural and urban. As a quick background, Mercy Corps, we're a team of 5,500 people living working over 40 countries. And so we're a global team of humanitarians working together on the front lines of crisis, disaster, and climate change to create a world where everyone can live and prosper. And beyond delivering aid to meet urgent needs, we also develop long-term solutions to make change possible. So working both as a humanitarian agency and also in longer-term development programming. So to start, I'm going to discuss Mercy Corps' climate change strategy a little. As I mentioned, as a humanitarian organization, one of the reasons that we're focused on climate change is that climate is a key driver of events such as floods and drought that undermine development gains and threaten vulnerable populations, which increases their dependence on humanitarian aid. And so as an organization that focuses a lot on humanitarian crisis, we need to consider climate change and related disasters are accounting for higher and higher percents of major internationally reported disasters and causing massive displacements. In addition, as many of us know, climate change tends to impact the most vulnerable, including small-scale farmers, who are a key beneficiary group for Mercy Corps' development programming. And that we're expecting that climate change impacts are also going to increase the amount of people living below the poverty line. And so the impacts of climate change are really being felt by communities where we are seeking to benefit. And so defines climate resilient development as development programming that integrates climate change adaptation strategies while improving overall well-being so that the well-being can be maintained despite shifting climate conditions. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means and talk about our resilient approaches. And the climate change programming actually globally, we work in risk reduction services where we're making sure that communities have access to both information as well as financial services to be their risk. We also work in natural resource management, especially around governance. So how do states and communities create policies that reduce risk and make sure that natural resources are sustainably managed. We also focus on climate smart livelihoods. So how to diversify and increase economic opportunity that reduce climate and disaster risks. Mercy Corps at a global level focuses on the intersection between climate and conflict. I won't be talking much about that today. Are important components of conflict and violence, and Mercy Corps does work in cases with a lot of complex cases. This is a key area of interest for Mercy Corps. And finally, we work in climate finance, so making sure that the climate investments that countries need can be, in terms of mitigation and adaptation work, can be channeled to the most vulnerable countries that need it. And so I will be talking a little bit more later about how some of these program focuses.
I'm gonna, just a moment, Kirsten, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're still having some issues with audio. I'm trying to think of any solutions. I know sometimes people say that asking anyone not using video to turn off their video. I don't know if that would help for participants who do have their video on right now. Does anyone else have any ideas for how we can reduce our bandwidth right now?
Kirsten, I was going to say, would you like us to share your slides, and then the only thing you would need to do would be to do the audio through? Because we're getting about 50 to 60% of what you're saying.
Okay, I think another potential solution, just it might be faster. I can keep presenting the slides, but I'll call in on my cell phone and switch to audio on that and see if that will help.
Okay,
that would be great.
Sorry, everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you everyone for bearing with us. We tested this out last week, but we didn't have these issues. And as you might imagine, infrastructure like this in developing nations is not reliable.
Okay, I'm going to be joining from audio on my phone, so I'll switch over now.
Okay, thank you.
Between a couple different network providers. So apologies for the connectivity challenges. It is, of course, one of the realities of working overseas. So I guess did you hear enough that I should just keep going, or should I backtrack a little bit? Keep going. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Mercy Corps' resilience approach, which is a key component of our climate resilient development approach, and really is about how we frame and operationalize resilience into our work. And so how we work differently if one of our goals for programs is resilience. And I know the term resilience is used a lot. And so I think this is helpful in terms of building kind of structure and consistency in terms of the vocabulary I'll be using for the rest of my presentation. And so what is resilience? There's obviously not one single definition, but in terms of Mercy Corps' perspective, resilience is the capacity of communities in complex socio-ecological systems to learn, adapt, and cope and transform in the face of shocks and stresses. And for Mercy Corps, resilience is really a process and a way of thinking and acting, and not just an end state. And so we're really focusing on building relationships between people and communities and systems that will support them to plan, prepare, and manage for change, especially now in times of increasingly complex and dynamic crises. And when I talk about shocks and stresses, when I speak of shocks, I'm talking about either rapid or slow onset, shorter term events that pose a large disturbance to people and systems. And so these are often time bound with a limited duration. So for an example, a shock could be a flood, it could be an earthquake, it could be an increase in the price of inputs, or a change in price of different types of market products, or a global pandemic. Stresses are longer term, slower onset events that introduce disturbance in the system. And so they're not as clearly time bound and often are happening over a longer period of time. So an example might be land degradation, or changing rainfall patterns that are happening over the course of many years. And when we're talking about shocks and stresses, we're thinking about both exposure, which is the frequency of the shock and stress, as well as sensitivity, which is the level of vulnerability or severity of the impact of a shock. And so typical development goals in a typical development programming, not necessarily a resilience program or a climate change program. If you're talking about a general program focused on increasing incomes, increasing health goals, typical development sets well-being goals and then designs strategies and interventions to achieve the goals. And there's a basic underlying assumption that if these strategies and interventions are successful and communities continue to invest in activities and continue the work, that they will maintain and often improve this progress over time. So there's an assumption that as time goes on with development programming, well-being will increase. However, in reality, it doesn't really look like that. Big challenges such as shocks and stresses often get in the way of achieving development goals. And so even when we as aid actors make big plans to support communities to reach well-being goals, in reality, communities can slip back and often do slip back into challenges such as poverty or food insecurity or economic distress when different types of shocks or stresses come along. And as you can see, communities, once a shock or a stress hits, a community's well-being will drop. And once they start to build back, they might be exposed to another type of shock or stress. So we're not seeing that positive trajectory that we're looking for in terms of improving well-being over time. And so that tells us that just good development programming isn't enough. And so that progress in terms of achieving well-being objectives by Mercy Corps and other institutions are consistently undermined by disturbances and different types of shocks and stresses. And so development strategies need to be designed and implemented in ways that also focus on increasing resilience. And so we see resilient development is in the face of a shock or a stress. As you can notice from the graph, it has less of a decline in well-being, and communities are able to recover more quickly, and in some cases are able to just continue advancing their well-being. And so a resilience approach assumes that shocks and stresses are going to affect the community, and they look at how these are connected and how people and systems are vulnerable to them, and what capacities they need to ensure that they can stay on track towards their well-being goals, even in the face of shocks and stresses. And so when we create a resilience program, we analyze 4 different components. So the first piece is that we look at resilience for whom. And so we develop vulnerability profiles. So whose resilience capacity really needs to be enhanced? How are different people vulnerable to different types of shocks and stresses, and why? We're also taking a look at systems to help us understand systems dynamics. So what needs to become more resilient, and what systems are important for well-being outcomes for the population with a defined area. And this could be social systems, ecological systems, political systems, or economic systems. We'll also take a look at the different types of shocks and stresses. So what are we building resilience to? Where are we identifying specific types of shocks and stresses that threaten the target areas, populations, and systems? And then finally, we're looking at capacities. So what resources and strategies do people need to maintain progress on, even in the face of shocks and stresses? So now moving to Timor-Leste. Timor is one of those countries, probably the first country I've ever been to where I've gone to an airport and said, I need to go to Timor-Leste, and people at the airport don't know what I'm talking about. So I figured I should provide a little bit more background information than normal. So Timor, as you can see, is the eastern half of the island of Timor in the Timor Sea. And so it's located northwest of Australia in the Lesser Sunda Islands, which is at the eastern end of the Indonesian archipelago. So is essentially situated in between Indonesia and Australia. And you'll notice that there's a little carve out, there's a little region that is on the Indonesian side of the island of Timor, which makes things a little bit more logistically challenging in terms of program operations. And Timor is slightly larger than the state of Connecticut, or roughly half the size of Maryland, and has about 700 kilometers of coastline. Due to its geographic location, it's vulnerable to floods and landslides, as well as earthquakes, tsunamis, and tropical cyclones. The population of Timor-Leste is considered about 1.4 million, though we're a little overdue on a census right now. And Timor-Leste is a former Portuguese colony. It gained its independence from Portugal in 1975, and 9 days later was colonized by Indonesia and regained its independence in 2002. And so really, it's quite a young country. When we're talking about governance systems and development work, which is pretty critical in why Timor-Leste is so disaster vulnerable. It's also a very young population with the median age of 20, and 42% of the population is currently living under the poverty line. The economy in Timor-Leste is really dependent on oil and gas, and the state budget comes almost entirely from Timor's sovereign petroleum fund. Their other major export besides oil is coffee, and then there's kind of localized small scale, mostly subsistence level production of rice, corn, vegetables, different roots and tubers, cassava, pork, beans, and then different types of fruit. In terms of changing climate conditions that are impacting Timor-Leste, one of the major ones is that we're seeing changes in rainfall patterns and intensity, which relates to changes and increasing the unpredictability of the onset of different seasons. And so Timor has a dry season and a rainy season, which obviously agriculture is very dependent on. And because of a lot of these changes in rain and changes of timing around when dry season starts and when rainy season starts is making it very hard for farmers to use more traditional farming methods without good access to weather and climate information. As with many places around the world, we're also seeing an increase in air temperature, sea level rise, and we're also experiencing increasing intensity and frequency of extreme climate events. And so once again, as we're seeing in many countries, we've experienced quite a number of 10-year or 40-year floods annually at this point. And so actually I have just been busy coming off the recovery from a flood that happened about 2 months ago on Easter Sunday. We experienced a tropical cyclone, which affected over 30,000 households across Timor-Leste, but really devastated the capital, causing 44 fatalities and extensive damage to houses, buildings, which includes health facilities, including COVID-19 quarantine and isolation centers, public infrastructure, as well as agricultural land. And so this storm just 2 months ago destroyed over 2,000 hectares of agricultural land, which will have a major impact on food security in the coming months. And so this is kind of an example of these extreme weather events that we're seeing more and more regularly. We had one last year, not quite to this extent, as well as the year before. And so the major problem from a climate resilient development perspective is that Timorese livelihoods are highly sensitive to natural disaster and the impact of climate change. So over 70% of Timor's population is dependent on subsistence agriculture, which leaves them very vulnerable, as I was mentioning, to these changing rainfall patterns or the changing seasonalities. And then 36% of Timor's population still faces moderate to severe chronic food insecurity, which means that in disaster or climate related shocks and stresses, communities are very vulnerable to that backsliding and that dip in well-being that we were looking at earlier. And so Mercy Corps' solution is to focus on making sure that communities have inclusive enabling environments and are able to access and utilize improved solutions to manage the adverse effects of climate change and natural disaster. And we're doing this largely through partnership with public, private, and civil society partners. And if we do this, our understanding is that then communities will be empowered to use these solutions to build their own ecological resilience and maintain or increase their well-being in the face of shocks and stresses. I know that's very theoretical, so I'm going to talk a little bit more now about what that actually looks like and means on the ground. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about climate resilient development in Timor-Leste in both a rural and an urban focus. And so our rural programming has been going on much longer. We've been doing work in rural climate resilient development for over 8 years in Timor, whereas our urban programming really just kicked off this fall, which is not a great time given the global crisis, as well as recent flood events, to be starting urban work. And so you'll see in terms of understanding what those capacities are and understanding resilience needs, we are much more advanced in terms of what we're thinking about in our rural programming, our rural facing programming, and are really still going through the process of designing those strategies and technical approaches for urban settings. And so for rural programming, we're focused on building disaster-ready communities through the strengthening of vulnerable communities to minimize the impact on life and livelihoods caused by natural disasters or climate-related shocks and stresses. And we do this through building a sustainable model of disaster risk reduction through multi-sector stakeholder partnerships with government, private sector, and civil society. And you'll hear me talk a lot about these different stakeholder partnerships just because we find this so critical. And oftentimes development programming is focused on one or the other, but have found through our work that in terms of really building sustainable development, you need to be bringing together civil society and communities alongside the government and private sector to be creating more sustainable solutions. And so one of the first things we do is focus at a community level on disaster preparedness and mitigation. And when Mercy Corps approaches a new community, we start with a process that is called a participatory disaster risk assessment, as well as an action planning process. And we do this process to go through each community. And we're talking about, when I say community, it's called, in Timor, it's called a sub-village. And so we're talking about fewer than 100 houses. And we'll work together with this community to better understand the disaster risks, the current capacities and needs, identify vulnerable populations, and then work together to identify opportunities and solutions at the community level that creates our work plan for the rest of the program. And so in addition to providing us the information we need to design relevant programs alongside communities, it is kind of the start of our awareness raising, as often people are not fully understanding the disaster risks that they're facing and aren't always thinking about different types of vulnerabilities and vulnerable groups. Another key part of disaster preparedness is a focus on skill building. And so Mercy Corps works to build the capacity of local community-based disaster groups, including building their understanding of disaster risk management, helping them learn how to conduct disaster needs assessments, providing them training on first aid or other types of life-saving or search and rescue skills. We also, at the community level, invest in mitigation and bioengineering to provide more physical protection or mitigation. A lot of times in Timor, this includes building water management systems or water source protection, as communities are often experiencing drought and water issues, or are seeing their water during the rainy season being contaminated. We also focus on gabion baskets for bank protection and retaining walls. We help communities provide kind of more household level mitigation work by helping them secure their roofs to their houses, as communities often are yearly losing their roofs due to windstorms and in cyclones. And then we focus as much as possible on the bioengineering side, which is essentially using more nature-based low-cost solutions. So planting of grasses and trees in vulnerable areas that are in need of protection for slope stabilization, slowing down the speed of water or erosion, or for flood protection. We also do work in communities focused on contingency planning. So when we build disaster groups that we then provide skills and information to, we help them think through disaster scenarios. So based on those risk assessments that we have conducted with communities, we walk through each potential risk and what different levels of risk and what actions need to happen at each level of risk. So for example, for a flood, what needs to be done if there's a small flood? What happens if the river fully breaches its banks and starts flooding a school, which might be nearby? And so we come up with very specific plans. And again, this is at a community level of fewer than 100 households. So it being very clear in terms of roles and responsibilities, in terms of who might be providing assistance to particular vulnerable groups, and what needs to happen in terms of making sure that those local communities are feeding into larger municipal or national systems to be getting the assistance and support that they need. But often when a disaster is occurring in a small community in Timor-Leste, there is not going to be a lot of assistance coming to them in a timely manner. And once we build these plans, we will test them through a simulation or a drill. And so we'll have the whole community participate in terms of what we're doing during a windstorm, what we're doing during a flood, et cetera. Related to the contingency planning, our contingency plans are only really strong when there are strong early warning systems and communities have advanced understanding of different types of hazards. And this is a particular gap in the context of Timor-Leste, where we just don't have a lot of good locally focused weather and climate information. And so there is no current functional end-to-end early warning system in Timor-Leste that is gathering data kind of on local systems and through local automated weather stations, feeding that data up to more nationalized systems that are incorporating international data sets and satellite modeling, and then feeding that information back down all the way to the community level so that someone in a household is going to know ahead of time that there might be a major event. And so we are very early in the process of developing end-to-end early warning systems in Timor-Leste. And what you're looking at this picture now is us installing a river level monitor in a bridge that hopefully, when triangulated with some automated weather stations, will provide some near casting so that the community will be aware ahead of time as the river might be rising, and then receive that alert notification to help them focus on evacuation if necessary. And so a lot of these pieces that I've been talking about in terms of the disaster preparedness and mitigation are really, when we think back about to that resilient development approach, are about minimizing that drop. And so how do we make sure that that shock or stress does not really cause negative impacts in the community. And so we're trying to minimize that dip. We also work on disaster recovery and adaptation, which is that piece not focused on minimizing that dip, but starting to pick up after there is that drop in well-being. And so we're really doing a lot of this programming directly at the household level, focusing on building household level resilience rather than kind of more community focused preparedness and mitigation work. And so one of the big pieces of our work is making sure that we are increasing incomes. People's access to capital really allows them to make quick investments after disasters to be able to recover, whether that's rebuilding their roof for their home, or whether it's buying new seeds so that they can get back to planting if their farms were destroyed. And we've found that our approaches have really successfully been able to increase household incomes. Along with the household incomes, we've really focused on kind of gender inclusive models. And so in communities where we're doing financial work, we're also doing household decision-making modules to make sure that from a gender perspective, that men and women are able to participate equally in household decision-making, which usually lends to kind of longer-term benefits in terms of use of funds to meet longer-term well-being goals in terms of investments in child nutrition and more kind of sustainable household-related needs. Another key part of this is financial services. And so most community members in Timor-Leste are unbanked and are living in areas that are very, very far from financial institutions. And so we take an approach where we create village savings and loans organizations where community members are coming together kind of weekly or monthly to be saving their money and providing loans at very small loan rates to other members of the institutions. And our groups also have a particular clause around disaster risks. And so if there is a shock or stress, group members can often take no rate loans to be able to recover more quickly. And that access to capital both allows people to recover more quickly and build back after events, but also allows them to make strategic investments to maybe scale up their farming practices and increase their income over time. Another key aspect that we're working on in Timor is access to markets. And this is where that kind of focus on resilient systems is very important. So in Timor in particular, when we look at market systems, we're talking about farmers who are living very far away from markets, which really reduces their access to good agricultural inputs. It reduces their access to kind of information and best agricultural practices, and then limits their ability in terms of kind of selling their products or outputs. And so Mercy Corps has been working to develop almost a private extensionist network that will operate providing necessary inputs within communities along with kind of techniques and best practices, and then help communities to be aggregating their products and bringing those products to market to increase market access, especially to very vulnerable or isolated communities. And then a really key part of our rural development and climate sensitive development work has been what we call our nexus approach, which looks at mitigation and recovery and adaptation simultaneously. And so we've looked to identify value chains that provide kind of dual incentives or dual benefits, which both will help communities to mitigate risk and minimize that impact of disaster, but that also lend to recovery and adaptation largely through the generation of income. And as always with development actors, our resources are limited. And so one of the things that we found is that if we expect communities who are struggling to meet daily household needs to be investing in community disaster risk reduction infrastructure, we're just not going to see these investments. But if we can identify value chains that provide some of those disaster mitigation benefits, but also allow the community members to be earning income, this will allow for the kind of advancement and scale of these disaster risk mitigation value chains kind of beyond Mercy Corps or other development agencies' reach. So for example, we're looking at bamboo, which has a lot of disaster mitigation benefits in terms of slope protection, stabilization, slowing erosion, flood control and prevention, and also some wind shearing. But also community members, when growing and harvesting sustainably, can also be selling bamboo to kind of a national level market and earning income, which allows them to be scaling up that investment. Similarly, we work in vanilla, which is very important, not because of vanilla itself, but because from a disaster risk mitigation perspective, vanilla almost adds more value to trees. And so vanilla needs to be grown under shade trees. And so you get a lot of the benefits from reforestation and the mitigation benefits of tree planting. And communities will be more likely to invest in tree planting or kind of protection of forests if those trees are being used as shade trees for vanilla, which is a very profitable crop to grow and also has strong kind of national markets. And we are recently getting into bamboo and vanilla, and these particular value chains were selected partly due to really strong private sector actors so that we could be leveraging their expertise and funding and investments to be scaling up this work. We also work in climate smart agriculture. And this is an important piece, partly because bamboo and vanilla are really long-term crops. We're looking at kind of more household level and more of a fast return crop that allows families to produce more food. And they're growing mostly vegetables. And it allows them to do this during the dry season with minimum water requirements. And so we've found over the years that this helps households to be increasing their consumption of nutritious foods, and that they're also kind of able to do this in a way that minimizes land degradation through that's often done through more traditional Timorese farming practices. So during a worst case situation, we also do assist on disaster response, and we focus really here at an institutional level. Whether it's with national or kind of more regional level disaster response institutions. And so one of the really important pieces is having a really flexible disaster response fund mechanism. And this sounds very straightforward and simple, but a lot of times immediately in the wake of disaster, everyone is tied up in the bureaucracy of talking to donors or seeking more funding. And so we have a flexible fund that allows us to deploy assistance immediately. That often helps during the first 48 hours after a disaster in providing immediate assistance. So for example, as pictured here, during the flood 2 months ago, we were able to help run an evacuation center and provide food, wash facilities, latrines to community members who had been displaced from their homes and fled to a nearby church to stay. And so we find that this flexible response mechanism is really critical in terms of our ability to provide really urgent assistance after a disaster. We also help the government at multiple levels to be conducting disaster assessments and planning their disaster response. And so in this case, during the recent disaster, we worked to help the government plan their first ever digital collection of data using digital tools to conduct a survey of quite a substantial number of households that have been affected. As I said, nationally, there were over 33,000 affected. In the capital of Dili alone, there were over 20,000. And so our partnerships with national government have really allowed us to be working very closely to help the government collect good data and use that data to be designing strategic responses that help meet the needs of communities in the face of disaster. And quickly, in the case of climate resilient development in an urban context, as I mentioned, this work is really new, and it's been interesting partly because despite the fact that the government is almost entirely based in Dili, we're talking about a very centralized system and a centralized country with many development actors operating in Dili. We found that very few people are looking at disaster and climate change in an urban environment, despite kind of increasing impacts of disasters in an urban location. And so, especially as seen through the recent flooding events that have occurred almost annually in Dili during rainy season. And so some of the differences that we're seeing in terms of the really kind of rural settings versus the urban setting is that in the urban environment in Timor, Dili really has no clear or transparent urban planning process with no city master plan. And because of the way that governance works here, there's no city government in Dili. It's governed as a municipality, but really as it hosts most of the national government. There's kind of unclear roles and responsibilities. And there's very siloed departments within the Timorese government, in terms of the climate change department being separate from the disaster department, which is separate from public works, which is separate from planning, which is separate from local kind of local governance that connects down to the kind of sub-village system. And there's no mechanisms for forced collaboration across those different departments for kind of joint planning. And one of the other challenges is that communities really don't have a lot of voice or ownership over community land use or processes. And so decisions are being made about land management and about new construction in ways that communities are feeling impacts, but not yet having a voice. And so, for example, different roads are authorized to be constructed, but don't always incorporate sufficient drainage systems, which is then creating kind of flood risks for households who had been there previously with no challenge in the past from flood. We also find that, in Dili, there's insufficient livelihood opportunities, continued challenges around environmental degradation, and continued and increasing disaster risks, mostly from flooding. In terms of our urban programming, as I mentioned, we're still really at the early stages of launching and designing this. So I'm talking about our goals more so than our concrete work and impact. But one of the things that we're trying to do is improve the climate resilience of watersheds through landscape management and ecosystem management to better support the environment, economic, and social development in Dili. And the way that we're doing this is trying to ensure that community members, local government, and private sector actors, similar to in the rural setting, we want to make sure that all of these different stakeholders have the knowledge, the skills, and the capacities to access resources and to develop and implement climate resilient strategies and plans. And so what does that actually look like in practice? We really hope to be developing a governance body to look at, we're focusing first on a single watershed in Dili with kind of a transboundary approach in terms of bringing together different kind of local, they call them sukos or villages in Dili. So a transboundary approach looking at bringing together a diverse group of stakeholders from civil society, from private sector, and then from national and local government to work together to help us develop the program and make decisions around the program. And so the idea is we're going to be providing this group assessments, plans, and resources to help direct our implementation of actions to strengthen watershed resilience. And that sits within kind of a broader goal of making sure that the community at large within this watershed has improved knowledge, skills, and resources to manage and cope with shocks and stresses. And that will include kind of the awareness raising components in addition to improving household income and well-being. We're also incorporating the private sector to make sure that business and private sector actors have an improved capacity to plan and manage risk, contributing to socioeconomic recovery and development. And we found in Dili in particular, after the impacts of the economic impacts of COVID-19, as well as the economic impacts of the flooding, that businesses just are not creating plans or strategies thinking about risk and don't have the capacity or the capital to be recovering from those. And as I mentioned, our work in urban areas in Timor is very new. And so we still haven't really defined, especially those systems and capacity pieces in terms of what we're looking to build. And we really want that to be an inclusive and participatory process. So the last piece of our work really quickly is really at the bridging kind of the national to the international level. And so in addition to kind of this work happening both at the very kind of local level communities up through the national level, we're also helping engage the national government to be thinking about how to scale up investments for climate change mitigation and adaptation work. Of all of this work I mentioned, there's a significant need for additional investments. And Timor is considered a Smile Island developing state and a least developed country, which means it should theoretically be prioritized by climate change donors, specifically including the Green Climate Fund for access to funding. But despite this, Timor doesn't currently have, probably due partly to its small size, and also due to capacity of different institutions, does not currently have significant levels of climate change financing or big investments from climate change donors. And one of the real challenges around this is that international climate change donors often have very complicated and technical processes that are very frequently inaccessible. So when you're talking about institutions that might not have high English capacity or technical capacity to do very complex environmental analysis, to be understanding kind of proposal development processes. It's hard for countries to be receiving funds and even guiding other stakeholders or actors to be increasing funds. And so one of Mercy Corps' objectives is to assist the government of Timor-Leste to increase opportunities to identify, evaluate, and acquire funding. And once that funding is received, to oversee and manage the funding. And we really think that based on so many years, almost 10 years of lessons learned around climate change adaptation in communities, that we really want to be pushing for more scale to be increasing kind of the ability. We work in 29 small communities around Timor in our rural focused programming, as well as the capital for urban focused programming. So there really is quite a need in terms of scaling up the resources available for this type of programming. And so I know that was a long time to listen to one person talk. And so just for a few key takeaways, a lot of these are kind of development tropes, but I think they're tropes for a reason. But really, one of the main points is that solutions need to be developed locally. There's no real kind of plug and play approach. And we've found that each individual community needs to really be engaged to understand kind of their risks and challenges, what strengths and capacities exist, and what capacities they need to really maintain that well-being. And part of that is that participatory processes are really essential, and that different groups need to be involved. And there also needs to be deep analysis of winners and losers, both in terms of people and systems. So how is the work and how are the investments we making benefiting certain groups within communities as opposed to others, or strengthening certain systems kind of at the risk of others? And kind of as I mentioned in that last piece about engaging international climate financing, there needs to be more investment to take this work to scale. So Mercy Corps is one actor amongst many doing this in Timor-Leste, but really there are not enough. And communities are really struggling to deal with the impacts of climate change, which are quite significant. And even these kind of high level disasters, such as the one we just had on Easter 2 months ago, are not really receiving the level of funding needed to help communities bounce back and really build back better. And that is it from me before we go to questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. It's been wonderful to hear the story of the work that you do and Mercy Corps does in Timor-Leste. And I'm so glad we figured out our audio solution. It's been wonderful to hear your voice. So I'm going to start reading some questions that we have from the chat bar, and please keep the questions coming as they occur to you. So Anne Littlewood wrote, "This sounds like a top-down approach. How do you obtain buy-in from the government and the locals?" I think you're still on mute, Kirsten.
Oh, sorry, I did mute
Sure.
myself.
Okay.
So as I mentioned, kind of our first approach within any community is to be going to the community and working together to be analyzing what's actually happening in communities, and then to start building work plans together. And so there's a lot of kind of approaches and strategies that we're using, but really what the work looks like is different from each small community to the next, and is built kind of in coordination with the communities themselves. And in terms of buy-in from the government, that's another area where, we're working very closely in partnership with the government at kind of local levels all the way up to national levels. And they're really key stakeholders in terms of designing anytime we have a new program, and helping us participate in program design workshops and planning processes. And as I mentioned, in terms of some of our urban work, we really don't have a clear definition of what that work is going to look like. And part of that is just because we need this to be a very participatory approach and design. And so we haven't had the time because of COVID related challenges that have made convening difficult. It's been really hard to get that kind of stakeholder engagement that we need to be planning a program together. And it is important to be planning jointly to make sure that there is buy-in from the government and also from civil society and from the private sector. And so it's really something that is key in terms of building that process where people are kind of co-creating opportunities. And in our urban programming in particular, we have kind of an interesting opportunity where the bulk of the program budget we have set aside in a special fund where Mercy Corps will be the implementer, but it's really going to be kind of organized and directed by this management committee that's made up of government, of local community members, and of private sector businesses. And so that management committee, Mercy Corps, will provide kind of strategies and trainings and tools and approaches, but that body will be making the decisions about how Mercy Corps is spending our budget in terms of what kind of work is being implemented in this watershed in particular. So that gives us kind of even a kind of deeper level of ownership in terms of program approaches and implementation.
Thank you. I'm going to say something that's in the chat bar, folks. So I know I asked earlier if folks maybe could turn their cameras off in the event that might help with our bandwidth, but you are welcome to turn them back on. We're not doing a presentation anymore, so we'd love to see your faces if you feel up for it. So our next question is from Julian Meltzer. You mentioned the introduction of climate smart agriculture. By contrast, what role do you see for food sovereignty? It seems that food sovereignty might be a more resilient strategy in the long term, as it doesn't rely on external inputs, technology, etc.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that question. Actually, when we are talking about climate smart agriculture, what we're not talking as much about the kind of choices, and there's not really kind of a reliance on external or imported inputs. And in some ways, a lot of it is getting back to more traditional practices. There are some changes in terms of land use and different systems. And so it really depends on where you're looking at the scale of historically. And to be honest, I'm really not an expert in this, and I have agricultural experts in my team that help build kind of our technical approaches when we think about kind of our agriculture and food approaches. But there was kind of a major disruption during Indonesian colonization that really severely, not severely, but it drastically changed farming practices, and so moved people away from kind of more traditional foods to a reliance on imported foods. People started kind of repurposing land for different types of products, and lost a lot of the more kind of traditional foods that people were eating. And so in a way, when we talk about climate smart agriculture, we're talking about, maybe kind of building keyhole gardens that allow people to be using kind of kitchen gray water. But we're talking about a kind of use of traditional and kind kind of locally sustainable foods in terms of what we're actually kind of encouraging people to plant. And so it's definitely something that, as I mentioned, I'm not an expert in, but something I'll definitely look into more. But we try to minimize the use of external inputs in particular. The technology piece, I think, is the harder one, just because we're finding kind of, in particular, a big gap around weather and climate information. And so when we're talking about kind of information as a key input and potential benefits of technology, this is one of the places where we feel like we really need to be helping farmers to have better information to kind of changing seasonality, because people are being so negatively impacted by some of the changes.
Oh, we lost you. Uh-oh. Oh, we heard you for a moment. Maybe it will resolve. It says you're talking, but I can't hear. I think I heard a snippet of something you said.
Now I feel really lucky that we made it through the whole entire presentation so clearly. Good grief.
I know. Maybe you can try calling back in, Kirsten.
Oh, she's
Okay.
gone.
Okay, maybe I imagine that's what she's doing. So yeah, I mean, I actually had a similar question. Maybe I'll ask it. It's not specifically about food, but so many times when you have colonizers come in and imposed what they think is the way that the land should be used, they bring with them a lot of things that end up being really problematic in the long run. So I'm curious about like building practices, structures, and that kind of thing. So yeah, many times the indigenous people knew how to build things to deal with those sorts of crises. Hopefully she'll come back on here.
I'm curious if anyone in the audience works in development. And if you do, maybe throw your name in the chat. Curious. Or if we're all just students here. I know I am.
Well, I appreciate everyone being patient with our very international panel, or not panel, but our talk and its technology implications. So hopefully she'll join us here soon. Oh, I do have a kind of general question. Who knew where Timor-Leste was before this talk?
David raised his hand.
I didn't know until I started talking to Kirsten. I thought it was probably somewhere in Asia, but that was all I knew. Oh, Cheryl. That's great.
Where's Cheryl here?
Cheryl, do you want to share any of your thoughts about your experience working in development in the Peace Corps while we're waiting for Kirsten?
Trying to make it so that Cheryl can speak. Here we go. If you'd like to, there's no pressure.
No, because I very identify with a lot of the approach that's being taken by the Mercy Corps program that's being described. Because participatory approaches is what actually, after being in the Peace Corps and working in development, I came to Cornell to do master's work in international agriculture and rural development. And that's been a main focus of many of the approaches, is working closely with the constituents. And I also do it here working in the community garden program that I'm involved in. So this was, for me, it was very interesting to hear what they're doing currently.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. We had a power cut, but we're back, hopefully.
I'm glad you're back. I'm gonna pose a question from David Snyder, class of 1965. What is the traditional governance structure in Timor-Leste? Is it a village level primarily, or is there a history of centralized governance? How does this advise your approach?
Great, that's a really excellent question, and it's a pretty significant challenge here, just in the sense that there are traditional governance systems, and so there is local leadership kind of down to that sub-village level, that kind of 100 households will have a local leader. But in terms of decision making and in terms of budgets, it's a very centralized system here. And so most decisions are being made and budgets are being allocated at a national level with very little access to funding at a local level in terms of more locally driven development. And so I think this does really inform our challenge here as compared to other countries. So the program I was discussing that works in rural areas works in both Timor and in Nepal and Indonesia. And one of the things that we found is when we create that plan with each community in terms of what actions they want to be taking in terms of their kind of climate resilient development, in both Nepal and Indonesia, we're finding that local governments have the funding to be investing in kind of scaling some of those strategies. So Mercy Corps will be starting some of these investments, but then local communities are able to buy in using their local resources. Unfortunately, due kind of to this very nationalized system, we don't have that same ability to tap into local resources in Timor. And one of the things that means in terms of our work is that we need to be changing our approaches to be helping advise government about budgeting at a national level to try to influence policy at a national level if we want some of those investments to be happening locally. And so Timor is in a process of trying to decentralize some of their governance systems, but it's a long and ongoing journey in terms of giving more budgets and authority. They're starting with regions or municipalities, which there are 13 of in Timor-Leste, and then scaling that down to kind of the village and sub-village level. And so I think it's going to take a while until there are locally available resources and funds kind of to be able to engage local level leaderships in some of those kind of planning processes and decision making, especially around budgeting and investing of resources.
Thank you. I have a question. So regarding electricity and that kind of thing, is pretty much all the power, I think we might have discussed this before, but it might be interesting for others, is all the power pretty much from diesel generation? Is there an effort? We just had a talk earlier today about microgrids of solar and other kinds of renewables. What is being done in that area to build more resilience and independence?
That's a great question. And this is something that we were spending a lot of time researching and digging into right before COVID as kind of our potential next big pitch. And yes, so Timor is based almost entirely off of diesel generated electricity. And the company that provides electricity is a national company, and it's very heavily subsidized by the national government. And so they're actually selling electricity to communities at a loss. So for many years, Mercy Corps had a more locally focused kind of mini grid and solar grid programming that was helping provide lighting to really remote villages. But due to the expansion of the system, and especially due to the fact that it's being sold for almost nothing, it's really hard to expect communities to be kind of providing the investments needed to maintain their solar systems if they're getting electricity for so cheap. And so it is, given that it's a major loss in the state budget, this is something that we were looking at in terms of potential to be converting more to solar. But something that we decided through kind of some of our earlier scoping and conversations with experts is that kind of the best solution in Timor was going to be a really large system, and talking about looking at a national level, which would have kind of political implications and some political barriers in terms of thinking about who loses out on diesel contracts for importing diesel, and what their political connections are in terms of making the argument to converting to a solar grid system. But it's definitely something that we're looking into. And as I was mentioning earlier, in terms of thinking about accessing kind of international climate financing, this is the type of scale of project that's going to need a major investment. And so kind of an organization like Mercy Corps can help in kind of facilitating the government to have access to some of the technical consulting or resources they need to be thinking about how to design a system like that, and then how to pitch it to one of the donors who have the funding to invest at this scope and scale.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Kirsten? I think, we also have a group that I would be okay with you turning your camera on if you want to actually ask the question yourself. Feel free to raise your hand. Well, Olga, do you have any questions?
I don't have questions right now. Thank you so much, Kirsten.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm so glad that you are talking with us, giving us a real a perspective way beyond our borders, and knowing well, that so many of the people who are going to be most adversely impacted by climate change are the ones living in developing nations and equatorial nations, and that we need to be taking that into consideration if we're going to be having a really complete view in this Alumni College looking at climate change. So thank you so much for joining us, Kirsten.
Great, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and thank you all for your questions. So we're going to be having a closing roundtable at 4:30. There's a link here to our discussion in the chat bar. And there's also an opportunity for you to send us your questions for the final roundtable, but you can also just bring them up for the final discussion. So we will have some presenters there. I'm not sure exactly who, but I know that the majority of the presenters said that they would like to be present there. So you can mingle. If you still have burning questions that have been unanswered from any of the sessions that you've been to, you can talk to one of the presenters about it. And yeah, so you can find all the links to these sessions as well as great reading lists and SocioApp. I know Kirsten provided a lot of really great references regarding development. And you can see the full reunions program, plan out your agenda for the next week, and connect with Readies on that app. So I hope to see many of you in the discussion here in a few minutes. But yeah,